So, what if you could get your hands on a forecast for the entire 21st century? That's the incredibly bold and, let's be honest, pretty provocative goal of George Friedman's book, The Next 100 Years. Now, the idea isn't to nail every single detail, but to figure out the massive, deep down forces that are going to shape the world our grandkids will live in. But that brings up the first question, right? Can anyone really do that? Friedman's answer is kind of fascinating. He argues that reasonable people, the ones who look at today and just assume tomorrow will be more of the same, are almost always the ones who can't see the huge, world-altering shifts coming right around the corner. I mean, just look at the last century for proof. In 1920, Germany is completely crushed. Just 20 years later, it basically owns Europe. Fast forward another 20 years, and it's been split in two, a pawn in the Cold War. Then by 1980, it looks like the US is on its way out, and the Soviets are stronger than ever. The whole board just gets flipped, again and again. So how can anyone possibly predict the next 100 years? Well, Friedman says there's a method to the madness. See, underneath all of that chaos on the surface, there are rules. There's a predictable framework that limits what nations can and can't do. And that framework has a name: geopolitics. The best way to think about it is like a high-level chess game. A grandmaster doesn't have a million possible moves. They only have a few good ones. Nations are pretty much the same. They're boxed in by their geography, by who their neighbors are, and by their own core interests. And because their leaders want to survive and do well, they tend to make the most logical and therefore the most predictable moves on the board. So if you apply that cold, hard logic, Friedman's main thesis is actually pretty simple. The 21st century is the American age, not because of American values or culture, but because of one single unshakable force: geography. And the century kicks off with this just staggering reality. Back in 2007, the US economy wasn't just the biggest. It was bigger than the economies of the next four countries: Japan, Germany, China, and the UK combined. That's not just a small lead, it's a fundamental imbalance of power. It's playing in a different league. But here's the real kicker. For 500 years, Europe was the center of the world because it controlled the Atlantic Ocean. But late in the 20th century, something changed. Trade across the Pacific became just as big as trade across the Atlantic. And all of a sudden, the power that controls North America, and therefore has easy access to both oceans, is the power that controls the entire global trading system. According to Friedman, that's the rock-solid foundation of American power for the next 100 years. But, and this is a big but, this dominance does not mean it's going to be a century of peace. Oh no. Friedman forecasts that this new reality will actually spark a series of major conflicts as other powers rise up and challenge the New World Order. So what's the first flashpoint? A new kind of Cold War with Russia. Friedman predicted that as Russia tries to rebuild its old empire, it's going to inevitably start pushing against America's allies in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland in the Baltic states. And that would lead to a major showdown sometime in the 2020s. But believe it or not, that's just the opening act. The main event, he says, is a massive global war right around the year 2050. And this won't be anything like World War II. We're talking next-generation weapons, totally new alliances, and for the first time, actual combat in space. And this is where the future starts to look really, really different. Just look at these alliances. On one side, you have the US, allied with a newly powerful Poland. And their opponents, a coalition led by Japan and Turkey. Now, those probably aren't the countries you'd expect, but their rise is driven by that same cold, hard geopolitical logic. So why them? Well, for Japan, it's about survival. It's got no natural resources and a population that's shrinking fast, so it's forced to get more aggressive. For Turkey, it sits like an island of stability in a sea of chaos, so its power is just naturally going to expand outward. And for Poland, it's going to lead an alliance of Eastern European states that are dead set on ending the threat from Russia once and for all. Each one is just playing its most logical move on the chessboard. But what's really driving all of this? What's the engine behind these new wars and rising powers? Friedman says it's the single most important trend of the entire century: a massive demographic shift. We are literally witnessing the end of the population explosion. It all comes down to one magic number: 2.1. That's the birth rate, the number of kids per woman you need to keep a population from shrinking. And guess what? Almost every advanced country on Earth is already way below that number. The population bomb of the 20th century is being replaced by the population bust of the 21st. And this is going to cause a complete 180-degree flip on one of our biggest political debates. For the last 100 years, the problem was always, how do we keep immigrants out? Friedman argues that in this century, the problem is going to be, how do we get enough of them to come in as countries start desperately competing for workers? So here's the bottom line. This isn't some abstract problem for the distant future. This shift is going to force huge, radical changes in how we think about family, about retirement, about what a national border even is. And it's all going to happen right in the middle of our lifetimes.
Okay, so this brings us to the end of the century, and to Friedman's final and by far his most startling prediction, a conflict that grows right out of all these pressures we've been talking about.
Even Friedman knows how wild this one sounds. He actually writes, "The idea of a US-Mexican confrontation and even war will leave most reasonable people dubious." And yeah, it does. But remember what he said about reasonable people? They're the ones who often miss the impossible until it's already happening. The path he lays out is a logical, even if it's a shocking, sequence of events. First, that labor crisis we talked about forces the US to basically beg millions of Mexican workers to come north. Then, the American Southwest becomes culturally and demographically dominated by people of Mexican heritage. At the same time, Mexico itself grows into a major global economic power. Then, around 2080, a new crisis hits, this time driven by robotics making human labor obsolete, and the US suddenly slams the border shut. The result is an explosive confrontation over a huge region that is culturally Mexican but politically American. So, there you have it, a forecast for a century defined by American power, driven by a global population collapse, and marked by some absolutely shocking conflicts. It really leaves us with one fundamental question. Is our future really written by these deep, impersonal forces like geography and demographics? Or, just like in the 20th century, is the whole chessboard about to get flipped in a way that nobody, not even the grandmasters, can see coming?